I'm Ben Edmunds, brewmaster at Breakside Brewery in Portland, Oregon, and I'm here with your craft beer and brewing tip of the week. We really take a lot of pride in the fact that we're generalists here. I don't want to suggest by talking about understanding your limits that everyone has to fall into some sort of niche that limits them forever in terms of what you can or cannot do in your brewery successfully. We have for a long time tried to cast a big tent. That was what got me into craft beer in the first place, was the enthusiasm for going into a brewery with having a wide range of different flavors, different styles that kind of capture the world of beer. And I think that breweries who do that really well learn to add it to their kind of portfolio systematically and over time. So for example, let's say that we started by focusing predominantly on hop-forward American beers, right? That was kind of our wheelhouse first. Add to what your wheelhouse is, though, you have to be really methodical about that and choose things kind of on a project basis. And depending on the size of your team, the number of facilities you have, the capacity that you have, you may be able to manage a couple of those projects at once. But it is something that really takes a lot of dedicated effort. It doesn't happen casually. So for example, in 2022, we decided to start working on a year-round wit beer. Belgian beers were not our area of expertise, but we felt that we did have the yeast management skills, we had the market demand, and we had the ability to maintain a beer that was hazy in package that could allow us to work on a beer that was not re-fermented and that didn't have to be quite as high volume as some other classic Belgian farmhouse styles. We felt like this was an attainable goal because we had about half the kind of compositional pieces in place, but then really just needed to work on the individual raw materials and the yeast. And so we set ourselves about doing that using one of our small pub breweries for pretty much the last 6 months of 2022, just continuously iterating on wit beer, both altering raw materials, altering fermentation parameters, altering aeration parameters, altering yeast strains, to try and understand where our house flavor met kind of the raw materials and yeast that we were using in those beers. And we eventually landed with something that we're really proud of, right? That we were able to scale up to production and put out in cans and confidently say, hey, this is representative of this traditional style. You know, we weren't trying to do something too outre, something that was kind of totally novel, but it was a style that you don't see a ton of in the marketplace in the Northwest. And so it was really exciting to try and do something that was both classic but kind of distinct from what else was happening in the marketplace. But it took us a long time to work toward that. Another example of this that we worked through that I would encourage folks to do is barrel blending. When we worked in our spirit barrel program, we changed that quite a bit over the last few years. One of the other examples that I could have used earlier in talking about kind of understanding your equipment limitations could it be easily applied to a wood cellar program, right? If you only have the ability to fill or store 2 or 3 casks of barrel-aged beer, you may end up getting something that tastes great every once in a while, but the ability to consistently put out larger blends or blends of any real size that are going to be consistent is going to be pretty tough. It's not impossible, but it's very rare. Blending is an art that lends itself to having large volumes to work with and then being able to pare down what you want into something that's pretty specific and tailored. Our barrel program took a really big leap forward, in my opinion, in 2020, 2021. When we went from working on discrete barrel projects, say where we would take a single batch of beer, put it into barrels for X amount of time, pull that beer out, and then taste through the barrels, find the ones that we thought were acceptable, that were positive, and scrap a few that weren't up to snuff, and then blend that up and package the beer. And that was kind of how we operated, how many folks operate in terms of this kind of very discrete project, barrel-based projects. What we decided to do is really square our stout program, our spirit barrel program, on blending. So rather than having individual beers that we expected to have as individual releases later on, what we did was we went to a method where we had 12 or 13 different base beers in barrels of varying types, of varying ages, and would start to blend them to a particular goal when we sat down to the blending table, not when we sat down to mash the beer in. And that gave us so much more control because we were working with barrels that were finished at that point, right? But that required us to have and invest in a number of recipes. We had to have the capacity to push that in, the cash flow to be able to actually make those beers, sit on them, and then of course have the wood cellar space to do that as well. It was actually for us, one of the kind of few benefits of early COVID was that we had a bunch of bourbon barrels, a lot of malt, and a lot of empty tanks. But I don't think that someone necessarily has to do the number of blends and number of recipes that we do to kind of pursue that same concept. But the idea that you can kind of create a better platform for yourself in barrel aging beers by blending the same way that sour beer producers do and that alembic producers do. To do that with your spirit program, to us, was a huge eye-opener, and it's only made the beers quite a bit better. Again, in that sense, we're kind of recognizing limitation, changing what the limitation is for us, and then ultimately making better beer for it. Those were two examples of ways in which I think we've expanded our capacity, adding projects on that previously had not really been in our wheelhouse to take beer that was okay and make it quite a bit better by changing the way in which we're going about our production of those beers. To learn more about building a brewery-wide quality program, click on the link below